Welcome to Bat Therapy, mental health through the lens of comics and film. Be a fly on the wall or a bat in the cave, listening in on a friendship built out of a love for talking Batman, comics, and the everyday struggle to achieve mental health and happiness.
We're your hosts, clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown and educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and social media and find our Patreon at patreon.com/battherapy.
This podcast is about providing education and understanding and is not a replacement for mental health treatment or support. If you're needing help, go to bat-therapy.com for resources.
All right, so psychology spotlight.
All right.
So we talked about King T'Challa and
Yes.
Black Panther. Well, the thing that was standing out to me a ton, I think honestly probably because I'm so caught up in like LA fires and everything terrible happening over there.
Yeah, it's hard.
I was thinking about our conversation about just how much rains down, how many terrible things happened to Wakanda in this short period of time.
Yeah.
So King T'Chaka is killed in like a terrorist attack. Then
Before that in Civil War, a bunch of Wakandans at the beginning of Civil War, a bunch of Wakandans were killed, which is what brought
in like
everything.
a humanitarian effort, right? I forgot
Yeah.
about So you have that happening, then you have the king dying, then you think you have the king dying, and his like one of the main people that in his entourage is murdered. Then you have like essentially a very quick civil war, civil battle, I guess. Where you're literally pitted against one another, and then King T'Challa's back. Not even to mention, then from there, King T'Challa, well, even before that, King T'Challa's like, hey, I'm going to share our big secret with everybody. And so then the entire world knows about you. Then the snap happens. So your king does that to you. Then he's gone, as is half your...
And your chief scientist,
And your chief scientist. All these people, half your people are gone. And then 5 years later, there's just a lot happening. Oh, not to mention that before the snap, everything comes to Wakanda. So a bunch of you are probably dying in battle.
Oh, yeah. Lots.
Even right before the snap happens. So there's all this stuff that happens. So I was thinking it could be, I was going to say interesting. Maybe that's not the right word. It could be good to talk about what kind of like mental health or psychological support do you even like what do you do in the immediate aftermath
like
of
during a crisis?
Something, during a crisis, or even immediately following, like the days and weeks after. So like I know you and I have had natural crises, like the flooding, really bad flooding that happened when we were kids in our
definitely
hometown.
Bad hurricanes.
Bad hurricanes, terrible flooding. We know, of course, people with Asheville recently. Unfortunately, there are shootings that happen all the time, it seems like.
What happened in New Orleans was horrible.
What happens there are all these things that happen.
It's always something. Yeah, it feels like it's always something. Yeah.
And then there are people in war-torn countries. There's just all this stuff happening. And so, you know, the unfortunate thing is that a lot of us trained in mental health, we aren't actually trained to help with that. And it makes sense why not, because it's not a mental health condition. It's not a diagnosis that requires treatment for an underlying condition or symptoms. In fact, one of the things when it comes to these crises and these traumatic events is don't treat people's reactions like they are disordered. Don't treat people's reactions like they are symptoms, because there's this whole array of intense reactions that happen right afterward. And so it's more about supporting through that. And then, some people are going to have symptoms related to mental health conditions after that, or they might have something already that's exacerbated by it, but making sure that you see those as two separate things. So because of that, it makes sense that a lot of us in mental health don't actually know what to do in the case of a crisis. But unfortunately, there's tons and tons of crisis to be had.
Yeah.
So, I figured that could be helpful to talk about.
Okay.
But it was actually really cool because it's one of the, one of the reasons I nerdily want to do these psychology spotlights is it actually helps me learn some things about psychology or refresh myself or see what updated information is out there.
Yeah.
So, when we talked about, I think it was when we talked about PTSD and we talked about supernatural,
Hmm.
and we were touching on Dean Winchester after he came back from hell and all of that.
Right.
I think I talked about the VA having some really great PTSD related
Hmm.
resources. And they actually worked on some resources with a few other entities related to how to treat survivors or how to support survivors when it comes to the aftermath of traumatic events.
Hmm.
And so when it comes to these things, it's helpful to think of these things in a few different layers. So you have actually just like with a physical injury.
Okay.
So if let's say you're in a car accident and you have that immediate injury. So there are certain things you need to do to like triage it, first aid it, stabilize the situation.
Right.
Then you might do some like more extensive treatments from there when you're in more of a safe environment. And then from there, let's say you might have some surgeries or casts or things. And then later, maybe you have things like physical therapy and
Right. Okay.
other things, right? So for the same injury, there are different things that make sense for treatment based on when you're targeting it.
Okay.
Same thing for psychologically how we react. So
Is it
when hmm?
I was going to ask, is it kind of like when someone is trying to
Uh,
conquer a phobia and like the last step is maybe actually getting on a plane or going up high somewhere or
so
petting a dog or whatever it might be?
I hesitate to use that because um, there is this inevitable last most intense step
Hmm.
versus in these kinds of situations large parts of the people reacting to an event or going through an event they need certain things or it's beneficial to have certain things to help you stabilize. And
Mm.
then a smaller portion of those people are going to need some help with some additional coping strategies and maneuvering the reverberations of what's happening. And then a smaller portion of them are then going to maybe need like we talked before about acute stress disorder, and you can treat acute stress disorder, which is it's essentially like PTSD might be coming in the future,
Right.
but we've only had
Yeah.
things for, about a month or so. So you have these smaller and smaller amounts of people that might need higher levels of support.
Hmm.
Um, so it's more like you might have someone with an intense phobia. You might also have someone like me who wigs out by spiders. And so what you do for each of those people is the same thing. But
Okay.
if I don't love spiders, but I can move about my life versus you have someone with an intense fear of spiders and it gets in the way of their life, there's a higher level of support and more treatment processes that that person's going to need compared to the person who doesn't love spiders and wouldn't choose to touch one.
Right.
But if they see one, they're like, okay,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
I think that's more of a fair comparison because we don't want to give that. One of the main things that we want to be careful about is if we act like okay everybody needs like a mental health treatment or support,
Hmm.
then we can accidentally underutilize their natural resilience and underutilize what they already have for support.
Yeah.
So it's best in the beginning to one stabilize safety, really, especially if you're talking about someone immediately coming out of a situation, the first few hours, the first few days. What are the basics that they need? Do they need a blanket? Do they need hydration? Do
Right.
they need help finding someone that they know?
So this is
Do they
like
need
immediate,
information?
immediate.
Yeah. In those situations, you don't need someone to sit down and have you process through your feelings.
Right.
If you want to talk to someone, absolutely. But usually it's bare bones. Let's help you get the information you need. Let's make sure that you're safe. Let's make sure you are stable. If someone might need medications or you have certain treatments or accommodation needs or accessibility needs, making sure that they have all of those things.
Hmm.
And then it's okay, days or weeks afterward, maybe you then start making sure, okay, how are people how are people reacting to how their brain and body are responding?
Hmm.
So, how do we make sure people are using their support system? Do they have a way that they're able to cope when things are hitting them really intensely? Are they finding ways to still be able to have breaks or moments of rest from the intensity of everything? So it's still like basic foundational things,
Yes.
but you're starting to get more toward, okay, a person, they probably have more stability at that point in terms of like safety and resources.
Hmm.
Checking in about those things, but you're also starting to talk about, okay, like how are you managing? And then from there, after that piece, you might have people that things are still reverberating and they might want to get a little bit more help or support. And
Right.
that's when you most likely are going to start seeing things like, hey, does someone maybe have acute stress disorder? Do they have other things that could develop into mental health symptoms, and how do we help support them?
Okay. Um, it's it's very interesting because I feel like it varies from person to person exactly what they need right
Absolutely.
after. Like some people, it's just like, I just need a hug,
Yep.
right? Other people immediately lock in and it's like, okay, I'm not gonna be able to do anything until I at least have a plan of action, right?
Making
Like,
sure people have information.
yeah,
Yep.
like I need a plan, I need an action plan. I'm not gonna be settled, or I'm not gonna until like I have something that can help me move forward,
Yeah.
right? Some people, I feel like, just need to be listened to and heard. Like I
hmm
said before, some people just want to be held. Like there's so
Yes.
many different ways that, like, that immediate reaction, like what different people need. And so it's,
Absolutely. They actually, because there are like there's psychological first aid. So that was the one that the VA developed with some other like I think there was like a national child abuse resource that also worked with them on this.
hmm,
So the great thing is these resources are built for everyone. So here's what you do for a child or someone who's an adolescent versus an adult,
hmm,
which is really cool. I brushed through some of their manual stuff that's available online. You can check out the links. We have links, don't worry. Um, but they're one of the main things they talk about is don't when something terrible happens, we want to fix it.
right,
When people are feeling overwhelmed and you just know that they're experiencing so much, we want to be able to take some of that burden away. You can't.
yeah,
Now, granted, some of the things you talked about we can do. A person can give a hug. They can find someone who can answer a question
right,
if there's an answer that we know yet. If there's a resource that's needed or a person they need to find, we can help with those different things. But at the end of the day, we can't take away that an event has happened.
right,
And so, one of the most important things is, hey, are you the kind of person who can sit with that? And one of the first things they say is, um, don't don't be intrusive. Don't try and help everyone. It's
hmm,
more about being available, people knowing what you're there with and what you can help with, touching base with people, but only after you've paid attention and you're getting a sense of what a person might need, and
hmm,
also making sure that you at least have some basics down. So, you don't want to just roll up off the street, know nothing about the resources to help people, and then start
hmm,
going around and doing psychological first aid because it's
right,
not going to be useful then. But you want to be able to offer some basic comforts
right,
or needs if people have them, or be able to get them to the right place. But first and foremost, being able to, like you're talking about, being able to get a sense of, okay, what are different people needing? Because not everyone is going to need to be able to set up and create a plan,
right,
and vice versa. Not everyone's going to need to sit and touch base with someone about what has happened. And not ever. So being able to be flexible is really key.
Right.
And definitely making sure to emphasize all of these different reactions are normal.
Right.
And also for some people, they might need some help if they're able to take it. And so the further out you get from an event, the more a person can take on. Um, but some people might need just enough information to know what to expect and or what how they can get support later. So
Right.
making sure people know you're there, and then you're maybe just hanging around to the background in case they need something. It's a
Okay.
lot less it's a lot less. I'm not even sure you can compare it to, say, therapy. Therapy is something that comes down the line. This is more, hey, let's triage things. Let's figure out what are those basic things you're needing.
Hmm.
Let's make sure you've got a firm enough understanding of what comes next for what you might need. And here's how you can reach me or reach someone else if you're needing help in the future from here.
Okay.
And then it's later on they get more help.
I guess part of me wonders, like, how do you figure out what people need? Because some people
Mm,
can't outright say, I just need a hug right now, or help me figure out a path of what to do next. Some people,
yeah,
like, I always feel like in times of crisis, sometimes there's always just that initial shock where you're just standing
they're
still,
absolute people. Yep.
don't know what to do. Just
Hmm.
like I remember me and like I just even remember like a little over a year ago, my well, it was more than a year, it's about 2 years ago. I can't remember. Time just isn't real anymore. But my wife and I, we got in a car accident,
Yeah.
and it wasn't just that we got in a car accident. It was like there was an argument at the scene and angry people, and there was a mob around us, and then the cops
Yeah.
came and the cops told us to get out of there and told us the car could work, but it couldn't. And then we were just stranded in the middle of the city, in the middle, all like literally all night long.
No.
And and it was one of those things where we were both just in this state of shock. Like, yes, we got to figure out how to call AAA. Yes, we got to get towed. But right now, we're just crying and
Yep.
scared and worried because our kids are back home and we're here stranded. And it was just an absolute nightmare.
Yep.
But like my wife and I, we are two different ways. Like me, I'm like, I
Mm,
need to know what to do. I'm not gonna feel
hmm.
good unless I have what to do, unless I have an action plan. My wife, on the other hand, is like, I just need to be held right now. I just
Mm-hmm.
need to just let me know everything's gonna be okay. Like it's
Yep.
very, very different. It's very
Yep.
and I kudos to people that know how to help and reach out to people like that, like in that first case scenario, like that immediate kind of
Yep.
thing, because there's so many different angles that you have to be able to
Yep.
go at. Like, because some people even put up their defenses and it's like, get away from me right now.
Yep.
Like, space, like, just get,
Yep.
yeah. And so
Yep.
yeah.
So absolutely. You've pointed out a few different types of reactions people might need. And once again, when it comes to this thing, you don't just stroll to somewhere and go, I listened to bat therapy. They talked about psychological first aid. I heard this general description. I'm going to go do this thing. No, no, no. There's a training. There are things that you can do to be able to be prepared to do these things. And the cool thing is it doesn't necessarily have to always be mental health professionals because they're not always actually the ones in the best spot when it comes to these initial time frames. But it absolutely, but it absolutely helps to be able to get used to this process of how do I figure out what a person might need. Now, a lot of times people are going to give you some clear signs. And also we need to be careful also of saying there's a need that I need to fill
Hmm.
because you're then putting pressure onto that person
Right.
and they already have enough pressure. And so when it comes to these, that's why they talk about observing. And they also talk about offering something very concrete that a person might find useful going in. There's a
Okay.
difference between going in and saying, "How can I help you?" That's putting pressure on the person
Mhm.
versus, "Could you use some water? Do you need a blanket?"
Right.
Or maybe you see that a person is looking overwhelmed. They're in a really loud area. There's a lot going on. And maybe you say, "Hey, let's move to this quieter space if you'd like to."
Right.
Obviously, leaving people the choice for things, but what are ways that you can concretely just help reduce the chaos for a
Mhm.
person? And a lot of times, people are going to give you some sort of clue, especially when these kinds of things are happening. You're just in reaction mode. And
Right.
so, if someone is withdrawing to themselves, maybe you do check in with them, make sure that they have what they need.
Mhm.
But you don't need to smother them with attention and support because that might not be what that person needs.
Right.
But also, people might be numbing, like you said, numbing out,
Mhm.
dissociating a bit. They're kind of separating from the situation, and so it doesn't make sense to treat it like an everyday conversation. And so it's, let's hit the basics and take it slow.
Mhm.
You also want to repeat yourself a lot and keep it simple.
Right.
So like you were saying, I need a plan, I need to know what to do. But if I went at you with 50 different things and different details and made a complicated plan, that isn't going to work for a lot of people in this situation because you'd be distracted because your wife is crying and you're wanting to
Right.
support her and you're thinking of your kids back home and your body's still reacting to the fact that it was in a car accident and there were these
Mhm.
people being kind of scary about stuff. And so even if you're a planner, your brain's not going to be able to plan to the level that it would on
Yeah,
on
you
a
can't
normal day.
lock in like you normally can. Right.
No, not at all. So you keep things short, to the point, as concrete as you can. You repeat yourself where you need to,
Mhm.
and you stick to the basics.
Okay.
Now, days later, a few weeks later, that could be different. One thing I did want to throw out there too is there are a few things that they found don't really work, or it depends how you do it. So
Okay.
they've tried doing debriefing where you essentially get people together and you spend a chunk of time going over what happened and how people are reacting to it.
Okay.
And in the best case, they found that that doesn't really seem to help with people overall doing better, like in terms of how many people get PTSD and
Right.
other things in the long run. There are some things that say that it could actually be harmful to some people. And so one shot group, especially mandatory, is a big, big no no. Because remember, you said different people need different things.
Right.
Mandatory is a no no because you're not giving people a choice of what they need to do.
That's a good point.
Um, so debriefing, psychological debriefings haven't been shown to be helpful. And one shot things in general aren't always. Now, once again, in that immediate moment, you're just a touch point. You're getting people where they need to go. You're
Mhm.
helping stabilize things a bit. But once people have leveled out to that point where they can maybe talk about things a little bit more, it's helpful to have multiple times where you check in. It's hard to do. So a lot of times all you have is that one moment you're talking with someone, but
Mhm.
um it's always good to try and have a little repetition just so you can have check-in points as people go, because it's hard to, if a person is needing some support, it probably means they need some help with something and changing something, and it's hard to change.
Right.
So it's good to have someone you can check in multiple times. Um, so debriefing, not really something that they suggest. And so some people have really big reactions
Mhm.
as well. And so I think we've all probably seen a movie or watched a TV show where they talk about like giving someone a sedative.
Right.
Right? It's like,
Yeah.
oh, they were all over the place and we couldn't get them calmed down. And so
Here's a needle and they just jam it in them and then
here's
they
a
just
needle,
pass
here's
out,
a big old
which
thing. Yeah.
is it's a trope that I feel like is probably used too much, right? Like that's not
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's gone down, which is good. But I agree with you that it is a major trope. And so when someone is having a lot of intense emotional reactions, it is helpful to try and help someone bring that down. So you can help someone with grounding, something that we've done in mindful nerd moments,
Right.
focusing on breathing, focusing on naming different things in the room. Uh, Mindful nerd moment for Wakandans. We
Right.
will be hitting on that. But you can do some really basic coping skills in the moment to help ground somebody. Same sort of things that you use if that emotional distress is building up in therapy.
Hmm.
Um, Now, some people might end up needing something to help, like a benzodiazepine, so an anxiolytic, something that helps with anxiety. But
That's okay. Right.
it depends.
Okay.
So if you just zonk somebody out for
Hmm.
a chunk of time, especially if we're talking like the first like few weeks after an event happens, and you just zonk them out that whole time, it can actually be harmful. And
Right.
so the theory behind that is you're stopping the process of being able to like move through and the body and brain be able to like just like work through what happened.
Hmm.
You're sedating someone through that, and so it gets stuck, and then so there's higher risk of PTSD. However, it can actually be useful if you wait, I think it's like at least 1 or 2 weeks,
Hmm.
and you make sure you do two things. One, you make sure it's time limited, and
Hmm.
two, you make sure it's targeting something specific. So
Okay.
you're not sedating someone overall. What you're doing is, let's say a person can't really sleep. Helping them sleep is going to help them process everything. So
Right.
if they take something to help them sleep, or let's say it's specifically if they end up having panic attacks during those that first month or two.
Hmm.
So if you have a specific time frame for when they'll be taking those medications, and then you have specific symptoms or specific issues they're having, that it's focused on, then it can actually be helpful and reduce the risk of things like PTSD. So it's
Okay.
how you use the medications. So what we see on the TV and in the movies, unfortunately, most of the time sounds like it's the not so great version.
Right. I yeah, it's on TV. It's like they're hysterical, and then you just see someone come out and run up behind them and just stick a needle in their
Yeah.
arm, and then they pass out, and it's like, okay, now now
Yes.
everything's fine, and it's like,
Yeah.
there were no forms filled out here. Like there was
Well,
no.
and I love you use the word hysterical because that's literal. I mean,
Yeah,
women hysteria,
they
right?
used to
They're
say that
all
about women, like, yeah, hysteria, which is
mental health profession. We are not a perfect profession, just
it
like
is
anything else.
it still blows my mind sometimes, like the medical profession, like some of the things they used to think and they used to believe, it
Yeah.
feels so primitive for it to be less than 100 years ago.
Homosexuality used to be a mental health diagnosis.
Oh my goodness, wow. Yeah,
Yep.
like oh my wow.
Yep. Yep.
Just
Yeah.
like anxiety. Like that's so wow, that's so far out there. And I guess
Well, and
going
here's an interesting thing too is that we see it as like, oh, well, we culturally had to progress and whatnot. There are other cultures that have been far more progressive on some of these things than we have ever been.
right.
So it's very, yeah, it's very culturally interesting as well.
I I guess in addition to that immediate help that
Hmm.
someone needs in a crisis,
Yeah.
um I'm guessing that the same way they need that immediate help, and it's different, it's a very different process for every single person, like as far as the number of steps, as far as like what they need, like it, there isn't like a certain, like in the mental health field, there's no like gauge like, hey, by this much time this is where
Mm.
they should be,
Oh,
right?
I wish there was. I think a lot of people would find that so helpful from either end, just
Right.
knowing what to expect from yourself, knowing what to expect from a person. So no,
Right, like the
just like
different
grief.
stages of grief, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
just like grief and like stages, like wish.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all over the place.
Oh, now I'm
Um,
fine. Right.
yeah, yeah, I'm fine. So it's one of those things where the good news, bad news is there's no like wrong reaction. So I mean, can you imagine how terrible that would be if you were layering that stress on top of someone? Like, am I doing it right? However, some people have a really good foundation to be able to reduce the risk of something happening. So there are the ways that we respond to what we were talking about, like with medications, but also like, does a person naturally have helpful, healthy coping strategies, or do they have strategies that might end up taking away from things? So, like, if you
Hmm.
rely on like a substance, like alcohol or other things, then that can end up getting in the way. Or how good is your social support, your social network? The stronger the social network, the the easier it is to be able to overcome things. But also, how much loss did you have can factor in. Certain types of traumatic events are more likely to cause more reverberations later on.
Right.
Um, your genetics, some of it there's nothing we can do about, right?
Right.
You've got whatever you got.
Yeah.
What your exposure to trauma has been previously. So there are all these different factors. So we can look at a person, and we could rank order. Okay, here are the people most likely to struggle
Hmm.
longer with certain things, but you can't know. That's the tricky thing. Um, we usually what we tend to look at is, so they start looking at things like acute stress disorder about a
Hmm.
month out of an event.
Okay.
So it's not it it's not like, okay, a month is the demarcation line by any
Hmm.
means. It's just trying to consider, okay, um when it comes to an event, when is it over, quote unquote, because some of them don't have as clear of endpoints, but
Right.
how far out are we from the event, and are we able to continue with life, or is it creating reverberations that are getting in the way and they're not
Hmm.
getting better? So if they're not getting better, or it's not, a person's not able to move forward at a pace that helps them kind of keep up with everything going on. Maybe they're feeling like, hey, I'm getting better, but I feel like I need more support.
Hmm.
Those are good times to get some extra help.
Right.
And even if a person's like, you know what, I think I'm dealing with this pretty okay, but I've been through the ringer and I'd love to touch base with a professional in case they see something I'm not,
Hmm.
there's nothing wrong with that either. Um, but there are plenty of people that go through these traumatic events that don't end up with mental health symptoms.
Right.
And so um, it's, yeah, it's mainly looking at, how am I able to do with the rest of life, and the first few weeks, it's unfair to ask that question.
Right.
Once again, you and I have been through a major flood in our hometown. Can you imagine if it was like, okay, well, 2 weeks later, normal?
Everything's good.
No,
Gosh, I think I was out of school for like
we were out of school
over
for
a
so long.
yeah. I think gosh, I was at a private school at the time, and our school
Hmm.
was literally underwater. Like one of my
Mm.
classmates that lived out that way was like, Keaton, I don't think we're going to school for a while. And I was like, Nathan, how do you know? He said, because we're on my family's boat and all I can see is the roof of our school. Like it was
Yeah,
on that level. It was out by
it.
the fairgrounds. It was just yeah.
My brain cannot, just to normalize this for people, that my brain cannot comprehend that, and we live through it.
Yeah.
It's there are certain things that I think it's just very hard for the brain to comprehend, and
Hmm.
different people might have different pieces to that, but um normalcy is not something that just happens right afterward.
Yeah.
So I was talking to family about Asheville and their recuperation, where they're at with it. The tough thing is everything else keeps moving on.
Right.
And when the traumatic thing is happening, everyone pays attention and says, "Oh, how terrible," and they try and support and this, that, and the other.
Hmm.
And then you keep moving on.
Right.
And so I think it can lay on this expectation for the people who went through it, like, oh,
Hmm.
everything's supposed to be normal now.
Right.
It's not.
No.
And so there are the things that are the struggles that come from the fact that it just takes a lot to move forward from these events.
Hmm.
But then there are things like if a person's having things like I'm stuck thinking about the situation and what it means about me or about the world or what's going on to the point where it's getting in the way.
Hmm.
I can't do things that are important to me. I can't connect with people or right if something like that's happening, or maybe someone's having a lot of physical reactions that are getting in the way or unhealthy for them in some way, or maybe a person. A lot of times you see things like alcohol use go way, way, way up when it comes to things like that.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't start coming back down, that in its own right can have repercussions, right?
Yeah.
So there are all these things that a person can pay attention for that would layer on top of just the general things that they're dealing with the traumatic event. And once again, a person doesn't have to be able to self diagnose to go talk to someone, and you don't have to have a mental health diagnosis to touch base with a therapist. If you're wondering, like, hey, I'm wondering if there's anything I can be doing to just help me continue to process through what happened,
Right.
because you can you can be moving on with life and doing all these things and still want to have an opportunity to sit down and really process everything, and everyone has that right to do that, and some people want to do it through therapy.
Gotcha. Yeah. It's, gosh, I cannot, like, I'm just thinking about, like you said, like what's going on in Los Angeles right now and all the
Yeah.
people that have been displaced and like losing literally everything
Yeah.
that belonged to them, pictures that they'll never get back. Like, it, it's just, I cannot imagine the devastation. And it is really good that there are plans in place as far as like helping people pick back up immediately, and not just like you know what we're able to do, right? Like online,
Hmm.
like out, like the care react on Facebook, right? Like it's one of
Yeah.
those things, like, glad it's there. I don't think it really helps anyone, but care care react, right? Like, and it's just, but I am glad that there are certain things, that there are things in place. And like you said, make sure you check the links. Like, there
Yeah.
are links.
Well, and I want to highlight something really important about what you're talking about is you cannot underestimate the varying means of support. And so what I mean by that is sometimes we in the mental health field are put in a very difficult predicament where we are trying to support someone and we're not the solution. And I hesitate to
Oh,
use
I
the
see
word
what you're saying.
solution, but I think you're highlighting the fact that there are so many things that go into relief and into help and
Hmm.
into moving forward. And if someone has lost everything,
Right.
um, a therapist, yeah, might be helpful. But if that's all you have, I think that's a laugh in the face of whoever it is that's trying to deal, because
Right.
they need a place to stay. They need clothes on their back. Um, they need a connection to what they've lost, and being able. You talked about these memories. How do they able to stay attached and connected in some way? They need more than just someone to talk to.
Right.
And there's wonderful, powerful things that we can do in therapy. But one of the things I think is really nice to that they have in the psychological first aid is it just so concretely validates that.
Hmm.
I think when there are crisis scenarios that come up, or you're working with someone and a crisis scenario comes up, guess what? Us therapists, how we react. We go, I don't know what to do for this. There's nothing I can do.
Right.
And we freak out just like everybody else internally, because, like, come on, be professional. But
Hmm.
we're also like, oh my God, I really want to help this person, and there's nothing I can do. And it was actually nice to read that, because it was validating, like, yeah, uh, someone to talk to is not the only important thing. And so I think those are really important pieces too. Um, we there's so much loss
Right.
that is happening with LA fires. There's so much loss that happened with the hurricane. There's I mean, we haven't even touched on the loss in so many other places and ways
Yeah, I
that
mean
aren't even
the New
natural
Orleans
disaster
terrorist
and
attack,
unfortunately not. Yep.
yeah, mass shootings, whatever it is. There's like the thing is, and it gets, and the thing, what's bad is even when you're not like a direct victim, these are things that still hurt you.
Oh,
Like
absolutely.
it's one of the, like, honestly, I will, there's so many times I just dissociate and don't even watch the news because it's
Mm,
like everything's bad, everything hurts. This is all so
yep. Setting those
horrible.
limits. Actually, one of the because so the psychological first aid is very flexible. One of the things that it actually mentions is it can be helpful to let people know set limits with looking at the news and checking into what's happening um because you can absolutely overwhelm yourself. Now some people are really going to want that and it
Hmm.
might be helpful to them in some way, but there are many people where that's going to just be taking on too much. So setting limits with that stuff can be really helpful. But yeah, I mean, there's so much, and you're right. These things do hit us even when it's indirectly or secondary. So when all the terrible flooding was happening in eastern Tennessee and in Asheville, I have family in that area. I trained in that area. I know someone whose neighbor disappeared. Um, I was going through all of this stuff, and I'm here in Austin, Texas.
Right.
No one else was having this reaction that I was aware of where I was. I wasn't going through it, and do not get me wrong, there is no comparison to what I was experiencing versus the people that were going through it. But I was also it was very clear to me I was experiencing something that pretty much no one around me was experiencing. It was like
Hmm.
people knew what was going on, but everyone
No,
was
it
going
was
about their day.
horrible, but you like close to the act, like you know that road, you know those people, right? It's
I know the road. I know what would happen if you had 100-mile winds and you had all of these things. And
hmm
yeah, and so it is very interesting too when you have and they actually um witnessing or being a part of something, you tend to have more impact that happens to you, but
hmm
it's not just those people who are affected.
right.
And I think we all unfortunately get affected by a lot of these things. And
Hmm.
yeah, like you said with the news, sometimes we just got to take a break from it.
Yeah.
So much.
Yeah. It's, yeah. And so it's like you, whether you are watching it happen, whether you're a victim of it, it's one of those things, or like whether you're like in direct contact to it, you just have to, every single person is different. There is no timeline as far as, hey, this is where I need to be, like you said. And you just really just, like you said, find, like, see if you can find a support system in some way, right?
Yep. Hey, after the snap, Captain America, he had a support group
Good
and
point.
he's Captain America. So if a ridiculously
Yeah,
strong, 100-year-old dude needs some support, I think all of us can accept a little bit.
that's fair. That's fair.
Thanks for nerding out with us. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown.
And I'm educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Check out my TV and movie reviews on YouTube at Team JBS. Check out our website at bat-therapy.com, our Bat Therapy YouTube channel, and follow us on social media. And don't forget our Patreon page at patreon.com/battherapy. See you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.